Okay, everybody ready?
Yeah.
Honorable Speaker, the citizens of Hong Kong like having access to the internet. They like being able to look at Facebook, they like being able to vote, and they like being able to have autonomy. We think that it's only their right to be able to maintain these civil liberties and to have control over their future. We think Hong Kong has spent so much time as a British colony. They're much more connected to the West than they are necessarily to China, and we think that they should not be given back to China in 2047 and instead should be able to be an autonomous state separate from the nation of China. So we think what this debate is about is we support Hong Kong having its own independence. This isn't a debate about supporting an independence movement within Hong Kong that's already happening, and we think it's about Hong Kong gaining its independence, whether or not that would be beneficial for the citizens of Hong Kong and for the region or whoever other actors you want to argue about. So let's talk a little bit about the status quo in Hong Kong right now, and then go into two main arguments. First, how this would maintain the civil liberties of the citizens within Hong Kong, and second, how we get better outcomes for these citizens. So we think right now Hong Kong is its own city. They have a huge economic power, 5% of the GDP of China. They have trade deals with many countries that they might not be able to maintain if they were reintegrated into China or when they reintegrate into China. And then they also are technically separate from China. They have militarized borders. You have to go through customs in order to go from Hong Kong into mainland China. But China does have some influence over them. The deal right now is that China has quasi-control until 2047, when China will then reintegrate Hong Kong into the entirety of the nation. Okay, so first, how do we get better civil liberties on our side of the house? We think that people within Hong Kong, most of them identify as Hong Kong citizens rather than Chinese citizens. They have language differences because they spent so much time under British colonial rule. Many people speak English, certainly a far greater number than do within China. And there are also people from many different countries who have come to Hong Kong because it's much easier to get visa access to Hong Kong than it is to get visa access to China. So it's a more diverse population of people who couldn't easily reintegrate into Chinese culture and don't want to. We also think that they have grown up under democratic rule, where they have the ability to vote for their representatives, certainly to a greater extent than people within China have, where it's a quasi-democracy. They aren't necessarily able to vote for the people who they want to have represent them. They also have more of a market economy than exists within China, where they are able to have more control over creation of businesses, and there are more rights of individuals to start businesses and gain economic empowerment. We also think that they don't have the level of censorship that exists within mainland China. So you're able to access Facebook, you're able to access anything that you want to on the internet, and we think that these would be really that losing access to these types of websites and access to information, not being able to get an education that isn't censored and controlled by the government would be a major loss for the people who live within Hong Kong. We think that if they want independence, and if any people want independence and are culturally different and have language differences than the other people within neighboring nations, they should have the right to be able to separate and have their own distinct nation state. We think those are the requirements. They also have their own government structure already set up and their own separate currency that they use. They meet all the restrictions that the UN sets for having a separate nation state. We think that is a good reason why they should be able to do it. The second major thing is that they also have a strong desire to maintain separation from China. So in 2014, there was the Umbrella Movement, where China tried to come in and only allow pro-Chinese politicians to run for government positions within China. The youth of Hong Kong did not like this situation and revolted. It became quite violent because Chinese government officials cracked down on these individuals. It's called the Umbrella Movement because they literally had to hold umbrellas above their heads to protect themselves from tear gas. We think that the risk that people took on an individual and societal level to protest against Chinese government officials controlling their democracy, their ability to make choices about the way that their lives and their government should be run, shows that they have a very, very strong desire and very strong connection to being able to maintain separation from China as a country and maintaining Hong Kong independence. We think that because of this strong desire and because of these legitimate differences, they should be allowed to maintain that. So second, why do we get better outcomes for the citizens themselves? We think first we're able to guarantee civil liberties into the future, because right now they do have differences from China in their access to rights, and if they're reintegrated into China, they would no longer have access to the rights we've talked about, access to information, access to absolute freedom of speech that you're able to access in Hong Kong but can't access in mainland China. But we also think that it would be better for them economically, because Hong Kong is like a huge port city. They have like massive trade deals, and a lot of the trade into China goes through Hong Kong because it's such a center for this type of industry and because of differences in tariff rates. We think that if they reintegrate into China, they're going to have to pay more taxes that go to like the Chinese government and then are then redistributed through the entirety of China rather than going back to their own citizens. And because income is so much higher for individuals in Hong Kong than it is for individuals like throughout the entirety of China, that means that there's going to be harm to those people who are living within Hong Kong, and they have the right to be able to govern themselves and maintain the uniqueness of their profits. But we also think that they're able to get better deals with other nations separate from China. Like countries like Singapore are willing to work with Hong Kong in ways that they aren't willing to work with mainland China because they feel more of a connection towards those people because of like language and culture issues, but also because they don't want to support China becoming a monolith power within the region. And so smaller countries are more willing to make deals with, oh yeah, I'll take a POI if anyone has one. Okay, moving on. They're more willing to make deals with Hong Kong separate from China than they would if Xi Jinping now has control over Hong Kong as well as the entirety of the rest of China, and we think that's a harm to those individuals. We think Hong Kong, importantly, will be able to remain on its own and will be much better able to do so on our side of the house. Because like a potential offline is that they're not actually going to have control over their lives, right? But we think that like right now, China has a much easier time overpowering the will of Hong Kong citizens because they technically have quasi-control over the region, and because in like 30 years they're going to get full control. That means that they can do like small things like influence politicians who are allowed to get into election or influence tax policy at a level that they couldn't do if they were completely separate, and the government of Hong Kong didn't have to let the government of China know what they were planning on enacting as far as policies go. If they're now completely separate, the only way China can exert power is through things like military control or through like massive tariff policies that the West will not support. And because Hong Kong is so directly connected to the West, because it was literally like an English colony for 100 years, the West supports Hong Kong and will continue supporting them within their independence. Thank you, and very proud to propose.
Alrighty, so opening government comes up here and tells us that the people in Hong Kong like internet, they like their personal autonomy, they like their civil liberties, and they're not ready to like give up all those things to China. But we do in fact believe on the side of the opposition that they will be giving up all of these things if they declare complete independence from China. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why this is going to happen and also do some rebuttal. So first off, you talk about the first thing that I want to talk about is that in the end, this is not going to be beneficial at all for Hong Kong. It's just going to lead to war. It's going to question the sovereignty of Hong Kong even more, and it's going to lead to global outbreak. Why is this the case? Because when you see something that you're going to have, like you're more into bringing China's more into bringing Hong Kong into the fold slowly. They're bringing them in slowly. But when you say you are declaring complete independence and just cut all ties, that makes China become all the more aggressive. You want something more after it's already been said that you can't have it. That is why men like the chase is because it's really fun, or you realize how much you miss something after you cannot have it anymore. This is just going to make China far more aggressive. This is a classic prisoner dilemmas case. When you start becoming aggressive, when you start declaring personal autonomy, national independence, this is only going to make China all the more belligerent with you, and we cannot have any more terrible relationships within the East. We think that this will just lead to more war, and this will take away the sovereignty because there is no individuality, there is no freedom within war. And so we think that this is a major threat to security, to just declare complete Hong Kong independence. And now I'll take a POI.
So do you think that the people of Hong Kong will suddenly now miss having their booksellers kidnapped by the central government?
I don't know how to contextualize that and respond to that. Okay, so, and I'd like to keep going into my other points, is that it is just not possible for Hong Kong to do this. They are too, economically and militarily reliant within this, global economy to just declare economic independence. And you talk about how, they're going to have to pay more taxes if they end up joining, the Chinese government. But China's just going to put a bunch of tariffs on on Hong Kong and prevent, trade from being so fluid. And they're going to completely cut off Hong Kong. And guess what? A lot of, military weaponry is built in China, not in Hong Kong. A lot of food is from China, not in Hong Kong. They're not in the place where they have the resources where they can maintain this sovereignty and this independence. And so guess what? When you don't have food and when you don't have military power, your lives are at risk because you don't have some food to support yourselves and you don't have military power to support yourselves. And it's just going to happen in the end that even when Hong Kong tries to declare this independence, that China, this big, huge superpower that produces all these things, is going to swoop in and take the sovereignty away of the citizens. And guess what? The punishment is going to be far more worse than if you comply now, because we've seen this in the past with great superpowers that try to secede, and when this happens, the superpower comes in and punishes the citizens. We see this all the time within history. We see this with the difficult relationships between China and Taiwan. If Taiwan tried to secede and tried to declare its own national independence, there would be an absolute war between China and Taiwan. Alrighty, now take a POI.
Okay, so Hong Kong gets food from Malaysia and can easily get military support from the West. They're 5% of China's entire GDP.
Okay, and that's even worse because now it's bringing in the West into already tense relationships between China and the West. This is only going to contribute to more tense relationships between China and America, who are in this massive tariff war right now that's just going to completely hurt the economy. How about this on top of it, that the West is now supporting Hong Kong and helping support the secession of Hong Kong from China? This is only going to lead into massive outbreak and more power imbalances and more war. And guess what? No one wins in war. Not the citizens, not the people in power. The economy drops in war. The people's lives are risked in war. So we do not think it is better for the citizens just because of this basic lack of security that would prevail when you try to separate and say that you're independent. And so we think that we went on this side of the house because the fact that the security of Hong Kong becomes so the insecurity becomes so tangible when you declare your independence, because not only are you being aggressive, incredibly aggressive with China, which we think that in national relations, this aggression with China is just going to be combated with more aggression. We see this all the time with World War I, where when you mobilize troops in Russia, suddenly you're mobilizing troops in Germany, and then there's a massive World War I outbreak. We think that in this world, cooperation is far more important to maintaining peace and stability, especially with regards to China. And yes, all right. And now I would like to talk about a little bit of rebuttal. So, you talk about how the citizens have this desire to maintain separation, but we already talked about how you won't be able to maintain yourselves when your security is so threatened and when war is at risk and when war ruins the economy, your GDP, and your resources. And we also believe that this is a short-sighted view of the world, and sometimes the people don't know what is best for them. Sometimes they can see that right now they really want to be liberated and independent, but if they see in the long run that that's going to result in a lot of lives lost, and it will result in the fact that they will actually be taken away, their sovereignty will be completely taken away by China because they do not have the clout to actually go against China in any specific war. And we actually think that it would just tank the entire global economy if they did start going to war, and then the West started coming in and supporting Hong Kong, and then the West and the East were at war with each other. We just think that this would not benefit anyone, and no one would want it. No one wants war. No one benefits from war. All those glory stories of war are just glorified stories. They're not actual facts. And also, I'd like to refute the point about access to information. First off, in a globalized economy, people in China are constantly growing more and more access to information, maybe at a slower rate, but they are still getting more access to information. And we think that the benefits of not maintaining complete independence from Hong Kong outweighs the costs of becoming completely independent. And we've already seen what's happening with Russia interfering with U.S. Intelligence and U.S. news, and we think that if it started becoming really aggressive in Hong Kong, that China would definitely come in and influence all of these technological ways that people get access to information within Hong Kong. We already see this in the United States between Russia and the U.S. So we think that in fact that access to information is kind of a wash. Press 2 propose.
Is everyone ready? The opposition's case to this motion is completely based off of the whole world falling into global war and entire economic collapse, which we believe is completely ridiculous for several reasons. We're going to refute this scenario that China will invade and the United States will invade, and all of a sudden you're getting everyone in the world caught up in this war, which is kind of ridiculous. And we're going to point out why there is not a lack of security when it comes to Hong Kong. Because several reasons. One, Hong Kong has strong allies with the West and a flourishing economy that makes them sustainable for themselves. So we have shown, because Hong Kong has stronger ties to other Western countries, like Singapore and Macau and the British and the Americans, than the rest of China does. So the United States will come to the backing, and the British will come back to the aid of Hong Kong in this scenario. And the West has a big interest in keeping Hong Kong as a more open market than letting it fall into the hands of China. So we're not doubting here whether the U.S. and the West will come to support Hong Kong if it chooses to become independent, but they will. Because Hong Kong itself is a huge market, and it would be a major loss if it fell into the hands of the Chinese and they closed it up. And second, they're assuming just because there's one country next to a bigger country that it's going to be invaded, which is simply not the case. The world is more complicated than that. For example, why doesn't India just conquer Sri Lanka? Why doesn't the U.S. conquer Canada? Because there's stronger forces out here. Yes, let's get POI.
The U.S. doesn't conquer Canada because they're relatively equal forces that are really on good terms. But when you agree that if you're right next to someone, it's far easier to invade them than it is when they're far apart. And also, if you have interest within that, so if you have an interest within Hong Kong, are you far likely to go in and invade when it's right there? And also, you have far more power.
Okay, see, your side of the house. And your whole belief here is a very outdated interpretation of realist international politics that ignores values, alliances, and economics. You're assuming that simply just because there's one country next door to another and one is more powerful, that one is inevitably going to invade. But we've shown that no, because the world is more globally connected now than it was back in the medieval ages when that happened. Because, as you mentioned, the economics, the world is more complicated because it's tied to the West, or Western influences preventing Hong Kong from going, because China has other things to deal with besides Hong Kong. China's trying to, fix itself and bring itself up from the ground. China's trying to build this One Belt, One Road initiative. China doesn't want more tariffs from the West. China wants tariffs to be reduced with the West, and going after Hong Kong will just completely shut off China and form a blockade with the rest of the world, because the world doesn't want Hong Kong to be taken over by China. So if they try to make any move towards an independent Hong Kong and try to conquer an independent Hong Kong, that's it. They're shut off from anything related to the West, which drastically harms their economy and hurts them more than they gain from Hong Kong. So I'll take a POI from the back out.
Okay, China's made it abundantly clear in the past few months that they're not above using economic disincentives to try to change behavior they find objectionable, even if it's on a very great magnitude. If they were to provide some sort of economic ultimatum against the United States or the EU, what incentive would the United States or EU have not to comply with them?
So now we're moving on away to economic incentives, instead of the whole global war of the opening half opposition. So on your point, you're saying that they will use a blockade and they'll try to put tariffs in other countries to prevent them from supporting Hong Kong. And we say that ultimately the other countries in the world are not going to be as intimidated by Chinese tariffs, because we can put those same tariffs back on them. We're already no, I've already taken POIs from you. So they're saying that, China will just put tariffs on the countries to prevent them from getting involved in Hong Kong. We will put tariffs on China to prevent them from getting involved in Hong Kong. So it can go both ways. And the whole West uniting against China, the whole entire Western region trying to limit China does more than China itself trying to limit everyone else. And ultimately, Hong Kong itself has a thriving economy with a large population that makes it sustainable for itself. And its ties to other countries such as Malaysia where it gets food, and places like Singapore and Macau means it can still get resources, and it still can have a massive amount of global trade, even if China closes the border that it has with Hong Kong. So ultimately, their whole point that the opening opposition has brought up will simply not happen, because as I mentioned, this is not just like a medieval, like, strong man versus weak man argument that China's just going to come and take over and then it's going to lead to global war. There are a lot more complicated things. China has its own issues to deal with. China's not in the best situation economically right now. Hong Kong is a better economy, and China can't take the burden of the whole world uniting against it if they try to go after Hong Kong. And so ultimately this point about China, or about Hong Kong not being stable, not having security, doesn't really stand. And when we show that, and as we have, that this whole point of China not invading doesn't stand, they have nothing else to argue. That was their entire argument. So going into, and just like reloading some of the points that we mentioned, as I've shown, Hong Kong is culturally distinct. They have proven, and we have proven, that they qualify to have an independent status because more people in Hong Kong identify as being from Hong Kong than they do being from China. So they have closer and stronger ties to Hong Kong than they do to the country of China. They have had a very different history. They've had very different belief systems. Hong Kong is a place that believes in civil, liberal, democratic principles. They believe in the right to vote. They believe in the right to have an open access to the internet. The last thing they want is to be shut down. And let's say, even if China does threaten them with the military, even if they do, we think that it is worth the risk to go into a conflict with China if it means having your liberties, if it means not being squashed by like totalitarian government that you didn't like live a part of. China, the people of mainland China don't have an option here. But Hong Kong, the people in Hong Kong have lived their whole life under a more open democratic government, and why should we force this totalitarian government upon them? So we say, even if there is a conflict, even if there's a dispute, as they would like to mention, it is worth it for these people in Hong Kong to have their liberties and have their principles with them. And so because of that, they can protect their identity as people from Hong Kong, not from China. They will have stronger democratic principles. There won't be these crackdowns, these police brutal beatings of students just trying to protect the right to vote for in open elections for candidates they believe in. And ultimately, it protects their economic outcome because they have a stronger tie to the West and a better history of economic prosperity that separates them from China and will continue to support them through their independence, even if China decides to close off the border and trade with Hong Kong. So for the reasons of their civil liberties and their national identity and the better economic outcomes, and the fact that China won't get like militarily involved and a whole global war will come about, we are proud to propose this motion.
You're taking a poli-sci course?
We're in the same.
International politics?
Yeah.
Me too. Is it obvious that I'm not?
No.
Chocolate theory judgment.
Alright, is everybody ready? Alright, so I want to start off with a little bit of rebuttal, and then I'll move back into our main points, and then weigh and show why we 100% should win this round. So, the opening government is talking about how this will be so much better economically, because Hong Kong can build, like, all these great trade arrangements with different countries. But, like, if you're a country, and let's say, like, first let me just start off by saying China will clearly be incredibly angry at Hong Kong if they, like, completely declare independence. Because, as we've said, like, it's going to be Chinese in 40 years. So, like, if they're all of a sudden like, nope, like, we declared complete independence from China, and we will have, like, no ties with China, China's obviously going to be very angry. So then you get to a situation, Hong Kong is looking to build a new trade deal with a different country. So, as is China, they're both approaching this country. China could very easily be like, we will give you better terms if you do not trade with Hong Kong. Because, if you're that country, do you want to trade with? The biggest economy in the world, or some tiny city in the middle of the mountains, like on the ocean? Like, sure, they have trade, but where is that trade coming from? Through China. It is a very mountainous city. Anyway, China just has much more clout on the international stage because they are the largest economy. They have the most people in the world. They have the biggest economy. Like, if you're a different country looking at the two, who do you want to trade with? You don't care about who is more democratic. You care about who's better for you. And what's better for you is trading with the bigger economy, who has the biggest manufacturing plants in the world, who has the biggest technological spending in the world. Like, you don't want to shut yourself off from China, who's the fastest growing country in the world. I will take it.
So should we sacrifice these liberal democratic values just for the sake of money?
I'm not saying that is morally justified. I'm just trying to look at the world in a realistic stance. Like, this side is living in this, like, liberal fantasy land where, like, everybody's going to democracy and, like, we will never go to war ever again in the history of mankind because it hasn't happened in 70 years. But, like, think about it. Like, this is such an anomaly in human history. Like, there's no logical basis to believe that we will never go to war. And what's a bigger fuse than, like, declaring complete independence from a country as territorial as China? Because if you look at Taiwan, like, even the U.S., who's, like, definitely not friendly with China, if you look at it, they technically say that Taiwan is part of China because China is so territorial that they will refuse to cooperate with China if the U.S. even, like, puts on a document that Taiwan is not part of China, even though it clearly is not part of China. So then they say that, like, global connections make invasion impossible, and, like, how, like, realism doesn't apply because, like, it's all just this liberal world order. But again, that's just, like, not the case. Like, China is not a liberal place. They are an authoritarian dictatorship. They do not care about, like, liberal democracies or any liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. Like, what they care about is, what Xi Jinping cares about is increasing his power and his authority. And, like, how is Hong Kong declaring independence not a direct challenge to that? Like, do you think he's just going to sit there and take that and be like, oh, okay, they want to be a democracy. Let's let them do that because that's better for them? No, China is not going to act like that. Like, what China cares about is themselves, and it's better for China for them to have Hong Kong. So that's going to happen anyway. Like, if all that will happen if Hong Kong declares complete independence is China will invade, and then the Hong Kong citizens will lose all of their rights. But, like, the rights will decrease a lot faster and a lot more drastically. Because if Hong Kong peacefully transitions into China, then they'll just be regular Chinese citizens. But if they try to declare independence and then China has to invade, which, again, they will, then obviously they're just going to have no rights because they're the rebels. Like, if you look in eastern China with, like, what they're doing to the Muslims right now, it's horrific. And why do you not expect that to happen to the citizens of Hong Kong if they declare independence? Because if you look, like, all that's happening in eastern China is there are people who are Muslim, and China is afraid because they're like, oh, if they're allied to that religion, they won't be allied to China. But here, Hong Kong would be directly saying that they are not allied to China. I will take your question.
Okay, so Hong Kong would get huge amounts of international press. They have an allyship with the West. They have massive amounts of education and monetary resources. This isn't going to be the same situation as you get with Muslims in China.
I would say that I don't think I don't think America, especially if you look at, like, current Western leadership, they will not get super involved, like, as to fight China to keep the independence of Hong Kong. Like, if you look, America is clearly going into a very isolationist, nationalist trend. We just elected Donald Trump. Like, do you think that Trump would, like, come to the defense of Hong Kong, like, to save their liberal ideas? Just as China's not a liberal, he's not a liberal. Like, he does not care about the people of Hong Kong. He wouldn't come. If you look at Britain, and you said that, like, Britain would come and save them, Britain is also being very isolationist, not right now. If you look, like, they just decided to, like, get out of, like, a part of the international order and leave Brexit. I will take the back ask question.
The U.S. will defend Hong Kong because they uphold values of democracy that they represent. So what do you have to say about it?
I don't think that's true. Like, if you look at our current leadership, do you really think they're going to risk, like, put American boots on the ground to protect, like, these ideals? When, like, if you look at Trump, like, Trump is very much a realist. He cares about power and security. Not right now. I've already taken a question from you. So, in conclusion, like, on our side of the house, maybe it's not perfect for Hong Kong, but it's a much more realistic scenario, and overall it will be better. Because sure, they may lose some of their rights, and, like, they may not be as much of a democracy as they would be if they were completely independent, but that complete independence is a fallacy. If they tried to do that, China would come in and take away all of their rights. And, like, if not, just, like, get, like, I don't know, like, kill so many people. Because China has shown they're very aggressive, and they've shown that they are not they wouldn't shy away from committing like horrendous acts, like even crimes against humanity. So I think it's naive to think that that won't happen if Hong Kong declares independence. Also, if you just look at Hong Kong, they're a small, very urbanized place. Like, they cannot be independent without a huge external support from the world. And sure, you say they get support from Malaysia and the West, but is that really going to be happening if China is threatening all the countries that support Hong Kong? So in conclusion, it was worse for the people of Hong Kong to declare independence because China will completely trample them.
What I did, you did.
That's his job.
Mary's class.
Separate from China.
Okay, let's start. Opening opposition come up here and say that when China is going to when Hong Kong is going to be part of mainland China, they're going to lose some of their rights. We say they're going to lose all of their rights. They're going to lose their culture, what they uphold, their values, their customs, and their tradition, and we will not stand it. We don't want Hong Kongese to become like mainland Chinese people who don't have any right of democracy or who can't even vote for who they want as representative. Hong Kong now, especially, they can vote. They can vote on district elections and choose who can represent them. They have this system of democracy. They have this system where they can. This system cultivated during the UK, the British colonial rule, where they can where they can vote for people who will represent them. But even if China is going to invade Hong Kong when this happens, we believe that it is still morally justified for Hong Kongese to pursue democracy, because we believe that it is the most ethical thing to do for them to pursue democracy. They will lose complete autonomy maybe, and Hong Kong democracy will be suspended. The identity that Hong Kongese uphold, like the democratic identity, and they are much more different than Chinese right now. They would see all of these crumble under their eyes, and and we feel like they're going to push for revolutions, which we say backlash. Okay, China is going to have backlash, so let's just not do it. Hong Kongese also are going to have backlash because they will not stand for a communist regime when they will be integrated in mainland China. But we have our main extension is about the economy of Hong Kong and how it's going to flourish more, and how Hong Kong can actually, if they gain full independence, focus on their more economical problem. Now, Hong Kong, yes, has one of the highest GDP per capita, but they have a high wealth inequality. And we believe that that's problems that Hong Kongese should focus on. That's the problem that Hong Kongese should focus on right now, instead of focus on problems of democracy that they already have. If they went back to mainland China, they would focus their problems would shift from economical problems to more of social problems like democracy, and pay higher taxes for over 1 billion people that they don't identify with, that they don't see themselves as part of the same culture or value. I will take.
How do you expect Hong Kongese to be able to address the problems of wealth inequality with a huge superpower threatening to take away all like the people's? Like,
that's going on our second point. Your main point was a huge superpower. China is the bully. It's going to bully Hong Kong. They're going to crush them. But as opening government already pointed out, Hong Kong has a huge support from the West. It has a huge support from the United States, the UK, and the Schengen area. And the EU. So, but it's also worth to point out that the UK and the EU members are not only tied economically with the NATO, but they also have the same common values of democracy that they are willing to push toward and help Hong Kong if it be necessary. But also, the United Nations is going to support Hong Kong more than China, because the United Nations is not going to stand for bullies. For example, we will have the UN General Council, the UN Security Council, and the the General Assembly are going to support more Hong Kong than China, and like more than 180. 180 countries which support democracy are going to support Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is not going to be crushed in this small place in Asia where no one is going to care about, because people are going to care about Hong Kong, because people want economic ties with Hong Kong, and people want to have better relationship and spread democracy. I will take back half.
Sure. China can veto Hong Kong's entrance to the UN, and even if they didn't, can still provide lots of negative economic disincentives unilaterally.
Even if China
veto
the United States bombed Iraq despite the veto of the Security Council. I think that even if China veto, they will still protect Hong Kong. That's not the place to say. What I'm trying to say is majority of Bush vetoed. And what I'm trying to say is majority of the countries are going to support in the General Assembly and the Security Council Hong Kong for their independence. And I think that and we think as closing government that this is a huge support that China is not going to have. If they are going to go around and bully everybody who is going to support Hong Kong, China has more to lose than actually Hong Kong, because they have huge interest in Africa. They are just plunging a lot of industries in Africa, and if Africans are going to support the West and America and the EU, China is actually going to lose more than Hong Kong in this sense. I don't think they're going to pursue to bully for a small island, as you say. They're going to risk lose a lot of resources that they are taking out of Africa, or a lot of trade deals that they are having in the EU and America, just because they want to bully and they want to insert Hong Kong in mainland China, or have more power. So we said it is morally ethical for Hong Kongese to pursue democracy, even if it means backlash. And even if there is backlash, we believe that there's going to be more support from the West and other countries of the General Assembly to support Hong Kong than they will support China. And Hong Kong will not be the only one losing from economic deals if the General Assembly also are willing to push toward that. Our countries in Hong Kong, their point about war China still needs cooperation. China is still developing, and that's our point. China is still developing, and they are not going to be willing to risk and be as a big bully as sometimes the United States is, because the United States has achieved a certain economical independence that China still is going to try to expand. China just started to expand their economy and going out to the world. They're not going to risk closing doors of all of those people around the world, all of these countries, just because they want to integrate Hong Kong. And we believe that because they have more to lose, they are going to be more willing, if Hong Kongese are willing, to gain independence and they are not going to bully Hong Kong in their turn. Hong Kong is going to have more democracy, more values. They're going to be able to pretend their culture and what they value the most, and the world is going to support them in their endeavors. I'm absolutely proud to propose this motion.
Amanda.
Not even to brag. I've just been judging. I feel like this best round.
We've been
Honorable Chair, as CO, today we're going to give you a contextualization of what this aggression that OO wants to talk about is going to actually look like. We're going to give you a fuller IR analysis of what's actually going to happen here, rather than just screaming war. And we also think, and we're also going to respond to this idea of civil liberty that's coming out of both OG and CG, and respond to this whole idea of how somehow the Hong Kongese are going to lose their liberty. So, okay, first, the extension that I'm giving you today is about the detrimental impacts on Hong Kong's soft power, both geopolitically and economically, and how this is ultimately going to be bad for the Hong Kong people if we go through this motion. So let's start off with geopolitical ramifications, right? We think that by Hong Kong becoming independent, this is a direct threat to Chinese sovereignty and power. Under OG comes out and tells you, well, it's kind of like quasi-rule, right? They're still kind of independent, but we tell you the important thing about this quasi-rule is that the perception is there that China still has power over Hong Kong, and that's the important thing. It's perception that matters. It's the international perception that China still controls or has power over Hong Kong. You can see this when it comes to Taiwan in the present day, because we can see how any diplomatic or economic acknowledgement of Taiwan ends up going badly. Like, we can see how China and the U.S. got into a squabble over it because Trump decided to meet with the leader of Taiwan. And so China still has the power to manipulate and twist economic and diplomatic relations for countries that, are, quasi-ruled. So, in addition, we think that that the response given to Nate's UN POI was insufficient, because we still think that a geopolitical ramification would be that China would be able to deny or just delay Hong Kong's entry into the UN, and because we think that when China gives countries an ultimatum, like you choose us or Hong Kong, people are always going to go with China, and I'm going to tell you why. Because we think that ultimately, economic incentives are always going to win out over any political or even democratic incentive, right? First of all, we think that when it comes to the economy, we think that, first of all, China's going to load on so many different economic sanctions and encourage other countries to do so. And we think that countries are going to fall in line with China's economic sanctions because China has the most power here. OG tells you that somehow, no. OG tells you that that Hong Kong has a lot of economic power, 5% of China's GDP. But China's GDP is humongous, and we think that this honestly is very insignificant compared to the power that China has economically. We think that the fact that first of all, that China's leadership isn't elected, which means that they have a lot more power in making different economic decisions, that they have more liberty to do so, and we think that if it ever comes to what Van decided to bring up, a tariff trade war or some sort of escalation like that, we think that works towards our side of the house, because we think that China, unlike democratic, elected leaders in the U.S., are more likely to be able to sustain a tariff war, which ends up hurting the citizens more than anybody else. And so we don't want this tariff war that Van is talking about. We think that this is a bad idea for the countries and for the citizens. Additionally, we think that we talked a lot about how free markets in Hong Kong and how that works, but honestly, we think that because Hong Kong is going to end up being economically and diplomatically isolated from the international community because of China's strongman force and power, we think that ultimately this is just going to allow for more free market exploitation within their borders because of unmitigated capitalism. Because we think that in terms of economy, China has better regulations over those kinds of things. So we think in general, Hong Kong isn't going to have those sort of regulations, and we think that business that oftentimes business works against these democratic values that OG wants to talk about. Okay, continuing with my extension. Okay, let's see. So, and we basically also, in terms of the economy, we tell you that the reason why Hong Kong forms a lot of economic or political deals is partly because of their link to China, and because people know, and people look to China as an indicator because of this quasi-rule and the perception that China still has power over them. And I'll take you in a second, but in regards to their democratic values argument, we tell you that we don't think the United States is going to value democracy over their economy. We tell you they're going to choose the economy every time. We can see this in the past when United States puts in dictators in places to maintain better economic relations rather than valuing the democracy of the country and thus hurting citizens. I'll take opening half.
So the U.S. government has placed hundreds of billions of dollars on tariffs on China for things like simple labor practices and trade practices, and you think they're going to shy away when they invade a foreign democratic country?
Okay, well, no. What I'm saying here is that we think that on your side of the house, things are more likely to escalate into an even larger tariff war or trade war than we're already having at the moment. And we think that in the end, this tariff or trade war is only going to end up hurting the citizens more. Okay, and then no. And then finally, a quick note on like militaristic response. We think that China is way more likely to become militaristic in response to this threat. You can see how things have become militarized within the South China Sea escalation and things like that. So we don't think that it's only that this is only going to happen like internally within the China-Hong Kong scenario. We think that this kind of militarizing response is going to spread to other places around the world. We think it can be a global response. We think it has the possibility to spawn a Taiwan global freedom movement, which we think like could end up having ramifications as well for the global world. So basically what we're saying here is that we think that because of Hong Kong's direct ties to China and China's power and ability to economically and diplomatically and politically stifle Hong Kong, we think that this isolation from the global economy and political world is going to end up being worse for this new state of Hong Kong and for the citizens. Because if you're politically isolated, let's look at countries like right now that are politically isolated, like North Korea. We know North Korean citizens are suffering, and so we think that. And my point being that when you have to end up turning internally, we think that like you take drastic measures in order to ensure that you're able to support yourselves economically. And honestly, it doesn't even matter like about the civil liberties argument. If you're not going to be able to have access to the means you need to like even survive or support your country, you're not going to worry about these sort of like civil liberties if you're just trying to find the means to be able to support your state. And so for these reasons, we proudly oppose.
About 6 minutes, isn't it?
Hers, which said it was like 4.5 minutes.
Yeah.
I started when she started her speech.
Okay.
That was 7, right?
Yeah.
You got this, Alan.
Okay. I'm just gonna disclaimer. This should be off the record and deleted after. I still want to get back to China. I have a Hong Kong passport and I don't want to lose it. But yeah, this is off the record. Thank you. Okay. So ready, set, go. Okay. So first of all, from opening half, we see their arguments of having civil liberties being added, being lessened, and Hong Kong's desire to maintain national identity, which we on closing half definitely agree with. But then here on the opening government, you have these arguments such as declaring independence leads to the clampdown of freedom and leads to this global outbreak of war. There's not going to be a war, okay? There are Japan, Korea, Taiwan. The United States has military bases in all of these countries, and they're so close to China. Why has China not started a war in the past 69 years since liberation, since 1949? If China was so keen to have war, there are already 3 American military bases nearby, so why hasn't the war started yet? So there's our first point. And then you also say that it's not possible for Hong Kong to do this. Well, Hong Kong already has most of this infrastructure. The people of Hong Kong have their own currency, their own passports, and their own independent education system. And this kind of model has been replicated all throughout East Asia. You see this in Singapore, which is a very, very successful city-state. I will take Quinn.
Wouldn't you say, though, that all of these like countries around Hong Kong are involved in China's One Belt, One Road trade? So do you think that they're actually like involved in the trade with Hong Kong if they're part of China's One Belt, One Road expanding trade route?
Your question does not make any sense because Hong Kong is also part of One Belt, One Road.
Yeah, because they're part of China!
Yeah, we're all...
So if they become separate, they're going to be isolated.
Out of order.
That makes no sense. China seeks peaceful relations with every single country, okay? So yeah, you also say that's not possible for Hong Kong to do this. Well, it's already happened throughout Southeast Asia. You also say that China tries to impose tariffs and stop food and stop water. Then why didn't China do that over the past 150 years when they were controlled by Great Britain? If China really wanted to take back Hong Kong instantly, they could have done it from when we lost the Opium Wars until 1997. But that didn't happen. So China's not just going to instantly stop all this food from coming in. And then you also say that there's this more power imbalance because now the West is involved. Well, like I said previously, the West has already been involved, and we have seen no outbreak of war. And then out of closing half on the government, you say that there's this detrimental impact of geopolitical ramifications and that China still controls. Well, because China still controls anything, does that mean that we should just let China do whatever they want and just abandon all hope of democracy and freedom and for the people of Hong Kong? No, it means that we should still try and do something. Then you also say that delay or denying that economic incentives will always win. Okay, well the United States could have gotten very, very cheap gasoline and petrol from Russia, but yet we still impose all these sanctions on them. So do economic incentives always win? No, because the United States values freedom and democracy, and we've done that. Oh, we've seen that in every single administration, especially in the Trump administration. Trump has imposed the strictest tariffs by far of any American president. I'll take Amanda's POI.
Okay, thank you. So no, basically what we're saying is that because China is so powerful in this regard, no country is going to actually look to cross China, and so we think that it's going to be a lot harder for Hong Kong to keep up the infrastructure and civil democracies or civil democratic liberties that you're talking about when every single country is going to politically isolate them and economically isolate them.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that. Well, first of all, China will not economically isolate Hong Kong because the majority of or impose all these crazy tariffs that you guys were talking about. Because the majority of consumers in Hong Kong are from mainland China. So do they want to tax their citizens even more? Like, no, that would just make the people coming from Shenzhen, the people coming from Canton, it'll just make stuff more expensive for the everyday mainland Chinese consumer. So China will not impose these tariffs on Hong Kong. And you also say that somehow, like, the people of Hong Kong, overnight, they're going to start starving like the people of North Korea. No, Hong Kong is one of the strongest welfare systems and one of the highest GDP per capita in the entire world. Much stronger than the United States. So that's, and this myth of this thing that they have about being the Pearl of the Orient, that is not going to disappear overnight. They're one of the most stable port cities in the entire world. No more POIs, buddies. I like you guys, but I got to move on to my points. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what Hajara said on her social, political, and economic points. So first of all, most of the people in Hong Kong have increasingly identified with Hong Kong identity and less with the mainland. Thus, we should honor the people of Hong Kong and honor their views and respect what they want to believe in for the betterment of our humanity. I mean, it's important for us to respect what other peoples want and other people's free will. And Hong Kong has also had a history of democracy stretching since the 1980s. It's really important that we can set this precedent because if Hong Kong has this democracy, then they can also set a model for the people of mainland China and spread this kind of liberal democracy and liberal democratic values to the people of mainland China and bring them towards freedom in the light of beacon light freedom. And the people of Hong Kong also speak a different language with different customs. I mean, they handle their own international affairs. I mean, we have Hong Kong ETO offices, economic and trade offices, all throughout the United States. They have their own consular affairs. I mean, the United States has its own consulate, quasi-embassy consulate in Hong Kong. So they're already handling a lot of these economic and diplomatic affairs. So it's definitely feasible for that to happen in Hong Kong. And then for the political stuff, the central government has been increasingly encroaching on Hong Kong rights and violating basic law. So we see this in Gui Minhai. He's a Swedish citizen who was just practically kidnapped off a train with 2 Swedish embassy officials. This is the kind of stuff that the mainland authorities have been doing for a long time. And these booksellers have gone missing and forced to go to Chinese prisons. You see this in Occupy Central, where a lot of the policemen were attacking a lot of these students and whatnot. And you also see now that there are mainland Chinese officers in Hong Kong with the new train station, the Yate Longim, one country, 2 checkings. And they also just banned the Hong Kong Independence Party. So we see, though China has so-called promised basic law in Hong Kong for 47 years and just the freedom of Hong Kong sovereignty, but then that simply has not happened over the past few years. And Hong Kong, if we allow this independent system, they can have full democracy. Right now, the chief executive is chosen by this panel of 1,287, I think. These delegates mandated by the central government, and they're all puppets of the central government. And even in LegCo, a lot of these, about half of the Legislative Council, LegCo, is controlled by the chief executive who is appointed by mainland Chinese interests. So only through this by declaring independence can we have independence. Also, economically, the ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, is also important for Hong Kong because we see in China, Xi Jinping is increasingly, in China, the judicial system is controlled by the Communist Party, yet in Hong Kong, it's free. So we have to maintain that kind of freedom. And that's why I support Hong Kong independence. Thank you.
We're going to put it up all over the internet.
Oh, God. I want to go back to China.
I already tweeted it out, Xi Jinping.
We're sending it out to your parents.
Oh, God.
Right now.
We're getting, yeah, I'll tell you guys that. I should put this on the record.
Okay, is anybody not ready? We think closing government's refusal to engage in any of our analysis about economic incentives gives us way more power to characterize what the world of an independent Hong Kong looks like. The top-level understanding that should frame your debate is the conceited argument Amanda made that China perceives its satellite states, such as Taiwan and Hong Kong, as being part of its sovereignty, and regardless of their functional independence and functional ability to engage in the West, views anything such as the U.S. calling Chinese Taipei Taiwan, or something like Hong Kong out and out declaring independence as a massive attack on its sovereignty and views it as having massive soft power consequences. We think this means that China has an incentive to act regardless of the veracity of these claims because they perceive it to be the case regardless of whether or not that's true in a soft power context. This means that we have three key pieces of incentive analysis that frame what our side of the house, or what the world of Gov actually looks like. One, we think China just has more leverage. They're able to outspend almost all of these Western governments just on a factual level, having more GDP and having more intimate connections with a variety of these countries. Almost all of these major Western countries have deep financial connections with China. China has close ties to the United States, yes, but they could easily stand to lose all their trade relations with Britain overnight. And you know what? Their GDP would take a hit, but they would function. Two, we think China, also they can stop UN membership, which we think is an additional major piece of political leverage that gives them way more power than the West has in this issue. Two, we think China has way less of a political incentive to care about things that harms that terrorists do to its people because there are no political repercussions for Xi Jinping if something goes wrong. Ultimately, what we think this proves is that if this tariff war happens, or if there are economic disincentives against China sanctioning Hong Kong or blocking their UN membership, China is inevitably going to beat out the US. And the immediate consequences of this are going to be negative material consequences economically in countries such as the UK and the US that try to sanction China. The result is going to be things like job loss and immediate damage both materially to people, causing more and more poverty for people in both countries, which is net worse for everyone, and means that there's net less political will, no thank you, and less political support in these Western countries, something China doesn't have to worry about, which means we think the result is, at absolute worst, China has way more influence than Western countries in Hong Kong affairs, and at best, I think this incentive analysis proves it's very likely that in the long run, China is able to win this sort of economic incentives war with just about anyone, because these immediate impacts on countries like the US and the UK create such immediate political ill will and material disadvantage that they will be prioritized way over the abstract valuation of democracy. I guess it's cool that you think the country with the highest body count of the 20th century has an obligation to stand up for abstract things like democracy and humanity, but I think pragmatically speaking, the US's actions over the past 100 years have proved that they have a much more vested political interest in doing things that allow politicians to remain in office and allow their economy to remain strong and have strong growth. Okay. I'm now going to engage in a couple, two other pieces of extraneous rebuttal. One, they say that we already have a military presence, and that takes out all of our military arguments. Military presence is not the equivalent of having a base. Secondly, they make this argument about how China didn't put tariffs on the past when they could have. We think China is way, way stronger than they were in the Opium War, and this is a nonsensical argument. Yes?
So you're saying that China would be accepting all this tariffs and reduced trade from all the Western countries. Do you not agree that that would outweigh the economic benefit of gaining Hong Kong?
No, we don't think it would, but we think our analysis has already demonstrated that China has an incentive to react incredibly poorly when Hong Kong exists because they perceive it as being key to their soft power. We think they thus have a much bigger incentive than any of these other countries, which have no real vested interest in Hong Kong, aside from trade deals, which China can easily outspend them on or financially undercut with things like tariffs or negative tariffs. China could even provide positive incentives to these countries to prevent them from trading or trading with Taiwan. And China could ultimately they have far less of a connection to these abstract things such as supporting democracy globally than China does to maintaining its soft power, which is uniquely key at this point in history when the pervading global narrative, especially when we get in the Trump administration, is that China is finally on the up and up. It is on its way to becoming the supreme global power. So we think this helps us win the incentive analysis debate, especially when closing government has given you no meaningful analysis to combat this. No thank you. I think this gives us access to a couple of impacts that are unique to our side of the house and unique to the brand of incentive analysis we give you. One, we think we get access to this argument about economic isolation and specifically how China is able to isolate Hong Kong from both their local market and the global market, which means that all of their arguments about civil liberties are implicitly answered by the fact that people are unable to access basic things like the welfare system that Alan talked about, are unable to access basic things like a widely functioning healthcare system or a consistently growing GDP that a country like Hong Kong would need. We specifically think this is bad in the context of a free market country like Hong Kong because if you extend Amanda's unique analysis against one uncontested, one of Hong Kong functions as a free market economy, and if it is true that in the status quo they have a ton of inequality, the net result of that is going to be that people in Hong Kong have not nearly enough leverage and are open to market exploitation, which means that there is no means by which inequality can be resolved, especially if China can just unilaterally deny them UN membership and deny them any of the benefits of globalization. We also think this creates a hair-trigger military situation that is not uncontested at all. This is not opening opposition's fairy tale idea of war happening because China is just really, really angry, but rather we think there are several points of immediate military tension that if China perceives its soft power as being infringed upon, it is likely to tighten up on immediately. This includes places like Taiwan, who are likely to see an immediate infringement in their civil and political rights as a direct result of this, or the South China Sea, which is terrible because that is one of the only probable places where a nuclear war or a nuclear escalation is possible in the status quo because the nukes are already pointed, and China's proven that despite it being a disproportionately small area, they have a vested political interest in maintaining it, despite it maybe not being in their economic best interest, which proves that China's probably an irrational actor in this case and will do nearly anything to defend it. Yes?
Even if Hong Kong has everything to lose, we believe that it is morally and ethically justified for them to pursue complete independence. Many colonies have pursued complete independence, even though now they are struggling economically.
I don't think a single speech in SciGov has given me a good abstract analysis of why support of democracy is good. I think the only impact analysis that can be weighed fairly in this debate is actual material impacts that occur. I think we're going to win that these abstract idea of having rights that they already functionally have for all intents and purposes and will continue to have for several decades are outweighed by the massive amount of immediate economic harms they see when their economy is able to be completely shut off and China is now in a hair-trigger military state, which is damaging not just for them, but for anyone involved with China in the global order. It's dangerous for Japan in the South China Sea and their civil liberties. It's incredibly dangerous for Taiwan, who would likely see an almost immediate crackdown so that no one could challenge their sovereignty, and China would probably shut down the sort of hush-hush economic engagement going on between Taiwan and the West that China covertly agrees to ignore. Ultimately, we think the result of this is an economically isolated nation that has no political capital, and if it even is able to engage in trade deals, will always be the weaker nation and have no ability to access any meaningful capital. This outweighs all of their impacts and means that they are not able to leverage any of the positive impacts of things like trade or globalization or civil liberties because they have a society in which the vast majority of people are no longer able to access things like a great welfare system or a growing GDP. Ultimately, this outweighs any impact Gov brings you and is more unique analysis than opening op, which means we're very proud to oppose.